Silver was about to be demonetized, and the territorial newspapers conveyed the common message that Butte's best days were behind it. Instead of liquidating the handful of mines his bank had foreclosed, Clark made a small investment in other teetering properties, including the original and, in time, the Stewart. Now sitting atop the remains of a mining camp that seemed futureless, Clark took a train to New York City and the Columbia College School of Mines to find out exactly what he had in Butte. A few months ago, I too was aboard a train pulling into Penn Station, still unsure if the story of Clark I had chased to New York was ending or beginning. Thankfully, I learned to navigate life in a place with no clear lines of demarcation. Like the rest of the generation that came of age in Butte after the eras of the Copper Kings, the Company, and the Columbia Gardens, I was raised by a community that, left to our own devices, uncaringly and perfectly blurred the lines between owner and worker, conservative and progressive, whimsical and practical, and past and present. Left to live in the no man's land between beauty and toxicity, the people of Butte forged ahead with self-reliance, fighting harder than we should have had to for every ounce of reclamation. We asked tough questions of ourselves and our predecessors, sometimes fairly, sometimes not, often wondering who owed what to Butte. Upon our arrival in the Empire State, a century and a half apart, Clark and I both knew Butte had value, but recognized that to fully comprehend the potential of our community would require an outside education. So thank you all for coming up to the archives here today, and thank you very much to the Butte Public Archives for inviting me to share this story. My name's Bob Brock, and I'm from Butte. I'm a union organizer with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and for the last 6 years I've held a position that covers all the western United States from the Mariana Islands to Colorado. And as you can imagine, a job like that gives me the opportunity to travel pretty extensively. And I spend well over half the year away from my beloved home here in Butte. A little bit of background. Last summer, I was asked by the Butte Arts Monthly to write a series of installments on some of these journeys, and especially the interactions I was having all over the country with one of Butte's founding fathers, Copper King William Andrews Clark. And so what you just heard was an excerpt from that series, and today I'll be sharing with you excerpts from all 6, as well as some pictures and some thoughts from along the trail. So generally in Butte, this is kind of the image I grew up with of William Clark, kind of the stern, serious, if you can find a picture of him smiling, let me know, type individual. We might have known that he gave the Columbia Gardens to the children of Butte, or that he had a blood feud with Marcus Daly. We might have heard something about an art collection somewhere, or know that he built the Copper King Mansion here in town. But what I didn't know, for example, was that he and his brother, J. Ross Clark, were also very important figures in early Los Angeles. And if you go down to the north part of South Central Los Angeles today, you will find the UCLA Clark Memorial Library, which is the crown jewel of the UCLA library system. I didn't know that that library was once the home of William Clark Jr., and that today it houses the world's great collection of Oscar Wilde manuscripts. I didn't know, for example, that there was a Butte-born Clark that died on the Titanic. I found that out by peering in through the window of a crypt, I promise I'm not that creepy, in Los Angeles at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. And these are some of the things that I found out about William Clark in the journey. Last spring, crossing the same desolate landscape, my thoughts turned to a young William Andrews Clark, cutting a hard winter trail in a laden wagon from Salt Lake to Montana. A few days before I tried the gate at UCLA's Clark Memorial Library in South Los Angeles, the ornate archive was closed for seismic fortifications, so I worked my way north on Crenshaw Boulevard, across Koreatown, then up the 101 past the Hollywood Bowl. There, in some warm weekend evening later on in the summer, Tchaikovsky would melt from the LA Philharmonic, and the patrons filling that beautiful space would know nothing of Clark or the distant mother lode in Butte that financed the whole evening. Travelers respect other travelers for their journey. Spend a couple hundred nights a year away from home, and you come to appreciate an audacious undertaking over broken ground like the one Clark made in an open wagon in December of 1863. Then he was just a drifter, a Pennsylvania Yankee rumored to have deserted the Confederate Army, his whole stake wrapped up in bundles of groceries he hoped to sell in Montana. He didn't know that the frozen eggs he carried would be the most popular, but as it turned out, even early Southwest Montanans had a penchant for Tom and Jerry's at Christmas time. This same basic lesson in business, being ready to supply an unseen demand, would build one of the great empires of the nation when Clark was already heavy in Butte copper, just as the world developed a dependence on it. Now, one of the things I didn't appreciate before I took off on this journey was that Clark's fortune wasn't just made here in Butte. Butte was the foundation of it all. And in a lot of ways, you could say if Butte was the bank account, Jerome, Arizona was the ATM machine. And my girlfriend Kelly and I went there last spring. And I'm going to take a quick moment of personal privilege to thank Kelly Bond. Because for the last year, there's been a third wheel in our relationship. His name's William Andrews Clark, and she's been nothing but supportive the entire time. And so Kelly and I went to the museum. It was our first stop there in Jerome, and this was the first thing we saw. It was a picture of a very relaxed-looking Clark, and I felt like he had found a place where he could be king without a threat to his crown. And underneath it was an etching of the Copper King Mansion here in Butte. And the rest of the museum told the rest of the story, how Clark discovered Arizona was he was representing Montana territory at the Louisiana Exposition in New Orleans. And the Arizona delegation had some more samples with him that reminded him very much of what he had been digging here in Butte. And so on his way back home here, he rerouted his journey through the Verde Valley down in Jerome, climbed the switchbacks at Cleopatra Hill, and he bought himself the United Verde Mine. That led to what was called the $1 billion camp of Jerome, Arizona. And it really boomed under Clark's tenure. And in the mid-1950s, like we know as a mining town here, they ran into the bust about the same time that we were blockade mining and starting to open pit. Jerome was closing up shop. And then the next exhibit in the museum there proudly proclaimed that the hippies moved in the late 1960s. And the hippies coming from San Francisco and elsewhere found basically a ghost town that they could take over. And they brought with them an appreciation for art. And if you go to Jerome today, you'll find all sorts of gallery space. And you'll find this shop called Nellie Bly. And what this is the ocular piece on a kaleidoscope. And Nellie Bly is the world's largest and greatest kaleidoscope collection that you'll find anywhere. So pretty interesting. And this is Jerome perched atop Cleopatra Hill, looking out over the gorgeous Verde Valley, and off in the distance are the red rocks of Sedona. As we first caught a glimpse of Cleopatra Hill from the outskirts of Sedona, Arizona, the torn earth and glass of Jerome, the $1 billion camp, twisted the midday light into color. The more I had followed Clark, the more I wondered what Butte would be today had he won the War of the Copper Kings. Would the children that married here, or the grandchildren whose first breaths filtered the energized air of our community, have made the same decisions as the victorious Anaconda Company? In a place that still values roots, too often before all else, would theirs have even mattered? I was thankful to be visiting another mining camp with my girlfriend Kelly. The spring before had found us further south along the border in the funky kindred lands of Bisbee. And even though I had turned 7 within a week of moving to Butte, Kelly's family and Butte blood goes back for generations. Her great-grandfather George, and Mark, your grandfather George, mined many of the mines here on the Butte Hill. And in the quest for this resolution that I was considering, I knew her deep lines of Butte blood would help draw the truth towards us, the way that gold finds gold in the wash. By the time we left, I realized it probably wouldn't have mattered that Clark won the war. And our trip to Jerome taught me it was no longer a question worth asking. The people there don't ask questions about what could have been, they just move forward with what is now. That is the luxury that comes with complete abandonment. To the 450 or so expatriate residents who pose each year for a town photo, Clark is just a fabled character from their origin story. Their great-grandfathers didn't work in shafts sunk by Clark the way the Kellys did, and they aren't still trying to clean up the pollution he helped propagate. Untangled by complicated roots, the people of Jerome can simply move on, the same way the Clarks did from both our towns. I don't have the luxury of time to go into all the details about William Clark and Las Vegas, Nevada, but it's an incredibly fair statement to say that city would not exist without him. Vegas is the seat of Clark County, Nevada, named in his honor by the Nevada legislature in 1909. And long before it was ever a gambling town, Las Vegas was a railroad town. And it was Clark's Railroad, the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake City Railroad, that city was dependent upon. Now that rail line connected his ports and his interests in the South Bay of Los Angeles with his mines here in Butte. And by the time he sold out in the 1920s, that town was as dependent on his railroad as Butte was on mining, which can be a tricky place to be, as we know here. And really through the end of the 1920s, the town was hanging on by its fingernails. They depleted the artesian springs that fed the trained groundwater. And in 1931, they got a lifeline when Congress appropriated the funds for what would become the Hoover Dam. It was then that they passed the bill legalizing gambling in the state of Nevada to fleece the workers coming in to build the dam of their earnings. Probably not a bad idea. They were, after all, union people on that dam, so they did like to gamble. So, this whole episode reminded me of a period of Butte's history that I'll get into here in a second, recent history. But before I do, I only have one picture of Las Vegas. And this was the actual map that they used to auction off the town sites. For those of you who know downtown Las Vegas, Clark laid the city out. And right over here, basically running north to south, is Fremont Street. So up here would be the Plaza, the Golden Gate, the Golden Nugget, the now demolished Las Vegas Club, the Four Queens, Binion's, and somewhere over in this vicinity, most nights under the Fremont Street experience, for a couple bucks, you can have your picture taken with all manner of half-naked fake celebrities. In early 2003, and some water, Butte was probably in the worst shape of its entire history. The Montana Power Company, the lone pillar of stability through decades of metal markets, had destroyed itself in the retirement accounts of thousands of Butte families on the rocky shoals of the tech bubble. The M&M was soon to be shuttered for the first time in more than a century. The mine sat mothballed, unable to pay its spiking deregulated electrical bill and turn a profit. Butte was fallible and its people desperate, and when a nebulous group named Fox Industries appeared in town early that year, they found a populace overwhelmingly ready to cash in the rich heritage of their community. For 2 surreal months, with assurances we would become the Las Vegas of the North, Butte followed the enchanting flute to the altar of wide-open gambling. In the end, the push for Destination Montana would be just another disappointment for a city that had already endured enough. And in a bipartisan vote in the Montana House of Representatives, the project was killed on April Fool's Day. And more than relief, I felt a deep empathy for the people I had felt were trying to betray Butte's legacy. Friends and neighbors whom I knew now saw no path forward. A few years later, still searching for a light in the darkness, the people of Butte gathered where it all began, in the shadow of William A. Clark's original mine. Unbeknownst to the huge crowd assembled that cool July evening, an economic meltdown was just over the horizon. It would ruin hundreds of thousands of Las Vegans and decimate places like Atlantic City, which had staked everything on gambling. Instead of compounding our problems with vacant venues and empty casinos, a few dedicated Butte folks had spent the interim believing in themselves and in their community. 10 years after the first National Folk Festival opened that night at the Original, the town has made small but steady footsteps of progress in a new, sustainable direction. Like the thousands of festival goers who stream up Main Street, past the new Northwestern Energy Building and the remodeled M&M, we climb on, reminded that the best bet Butte people can make has always been on ourselves. So, 2 cemeteries. We're going back to Los Angeles. This is William Clark Jr. And out of all the Clark children, he was my favorite. He was certainly the most philanthropic, and you could say that he maintained the closest ties to Butte and Montana throughout his life. For one, he married a Butte girl. Her name was Mabel Foster Clark, and she's right up here. And William Jr. was known, he was kind of your typical Butte guy in a lot of ways. He was known he liked to drink and gamble and maybe carouse a little bit. And they met and were engaged after one evening. It must have been quite a party. But unfortunately, the party didn't last. Mabel passed away a few years later. They had a home here in Butte. It still stands down near the corner of Galena and Excelsior. And she died following complications of the birth of their only child, William Andrews Clark III. Now, Clark Jr. Started kind of retreating towards Los Angeles after her death, and really became one of the most important early philanthropists in the city. This is the Hollywood Bowl, still one of the great venues of the world that Clark Jr. helped finance. This is me just a couple days ago down in Pershing Square, which is absolutely in the center of downtown Los Angeles, with a Beethoven statue dedicated to William Andrews Clark Jr., founder of the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra. So a great man like that is going to build himself a great grave. And as you can see, I'll give you one guess which one is his. This is down the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, right on Santa Monica Boulevard. This is Sylvan Lake. There's one crypt on one island in the middle of Sylvan Lake. And this area of the cemetery is known as the Garden of the Legends. And you'll see why here in a minute. But before there was all that, there was this grave here in Butte. And this grave's now empty. It's still down there in Mount Moriah Cemetery. And it was the first grave of Mabel Foster Clark, and she was buried here for almost 20 years before she was exhumed and moved to that crypt in Los Angeles. And when you stand at the same woman's grave in two different places, in two different cities, it doesn't really befit an essay. It is more befitting of a poem. And so I did a poem for this one, and it's a sestina, which is a Spanish form that uses a specific format of repetition for line-ending words. And while I'm reading this, hopefully, a slideshow will be playing of pictures from the two cemeteries. I stand above an empty mining town grave to ensure that I have not forgotten that sometimes there is a fatal fruit in the womb. A morning not so distant, I went to collect debts for our home at a crypt on Santa Monica Boulevard. I wish now I had known who owed what inside that bastion of stone. Instead, streaks of blue anger ran through me like marbled stone, not for indulgence enshrined in that grave, but for distant vistas our eyes had known, and the paired clicks of heels across dance floors forgotten. Do we not know each other as we know our home, family born of her azurite womb? Thanatopsis is the consequence of the womb, as the consequence of ancient death is stone. Loyalty is the consequence of home. Was that not why I went to your grave, to remind you of what I thought you had forgotten? This place we had all loved and had known. The silent response to the citadel known, I made my way back to our mother's still womb, to tell her the son of her father is forgotten, surrounded by stars in a field of stone. Was that not why I went to your grave, to curse you, William, for turning your back on our home? Yet I didn't know then of your Galena Street home. There life slowly drained from all that you'd known, and the consequence of love became clear and grave when you were left to raise the final gift of her womb. A new year rang in with a new headstone, still marking this empty plot now forgotten. Would you rather be cursed or be forgotten? What trade would I make to abandon my home? To have the journeys of heroes crest at my shore of stone, would I too gather up the few that I've known, and leave this stubborn life behind to take hold or falter in her womb, as a great foreign city rises around my grave? Two cemeteries are easily forgotten, unlike this one fierce truth I have always known, a lesson born of the mind womb of my home. For every magnificent monument of stone, somewhere, there is an empty grave.
Very good.
Washington, D.C. Thank you. So I think the historical treatment of Clark's quest for the United States Senate is pretty well covered. So I'm not going to get into the bribery or the scandal or the passage of the 17th Amendment of the United States Constitution, because that wasn't why I followed Clark to Washington, D.C. I followed him there for the art. And for me, this is the most important piece of this whole journey that I uncovered in my travels, because this feels to me like the one piece of this story that is still somewhat unresolved. And you'll see what I mean here in a little bit. As I am reading this first segment, there will be a slideshow of masterpieces, all of which were once owned by Clark, and all of which are now part of the deep holdings of the National Gallery of Art, which is a public institution founded in the 1930s by a direct appropriation of Congress. And starting with the Rembrandt, you'll see some of the stuff that he once called his. For a man from a hardscrabble town of tough guys, William's predilection for France and art must have contributed to his aloof and snobbish reputation amongst his mining city contemporaries. He found even less acceptance with the old money families on the East Coast. The pace with which the nouveau rich Clark accumulated wealth in art ingrained bitter resentment against both man and collection. Even if his Da Vinci's and Donatellos didn't hold up under scrutiny, Clark developed a notable eye for 19th century French artists, Italian maiolica, and Persian textiles. His collection included undisputed showstoppers by Monet, Renoir, Rodin, and Degas, old world furniture, and 2 Stradivarius violins, one each for his son and daughter. Following a political career that had soiled his reputation, Clark put his faith in his art collection to reconcile his legacy. And upon his death in 1925, his business empire passed to his children, whom I have discovered promptly began liquidating everything from the Butte Miner to the Los Alamitos Sugar Company. Not wanting the same thing to happen to his art, Clark placed rigid restrictions on its future display. It could be made available for the enjoyment of the masses, but only on the condition that they knew it was his, and the Metropolitan had the first right of refusal. In my hand, I'm holding a certified copy of William Andrews Clark's last will and testament that I got from the Montana Historical Society up in Helena. And for our purposes today, there's really only 2 parts of this will that are of interest. The first is page 1, in which Clark emphatically declared that he was a resident of Butte, Montana, and that this will should be probated here in Butte Court. The next section that is of interest to us today is Article 13, in which Clark spells out the terms for which he wanted all those masterpieces to be dealt with after his death. Now, when I went to New York City, I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art Archives, and I found many wonderful things, including this clipping that I absolutely love, because it says Clark's will filed in Butte. Not Butte, Montana, not Montana, because Butte was on a first name basis with the New York papers at the time. Down at the bottom, it talks about the Metropolitan Museum of Art being among the legatees. And what this will basically says is that the Met could have the art. In fact, they could have pretty much all of it, but they had to take all of it. And when they took all of it, they had to keep it in a separate wing, exclusively displayed under the name William Andrews Clark Collection, and they had to do that for the rest of their days. So the Met weighed this back and forth, and that whole notion might sound a little bit pretentious and a little bit crazy, and it probably was both, but it also was not uncommon at the time. And if you go to the Met today, you will see collections that predate Clark's bequest that are hung in exactly that manner. But in my conversations with the staff there at the Met, I learned that this was really a watershed moment in the history of that museum. And ultimately they decided that there were just too many strings attached, and they said, thank you, no. We're not going to let the dead hand of some copper miner from Montana tell us where we're going to put our masterpieces and how we're going to lay out our galleries. So Clark, I think, realized that the New York City crowd that rejected him in life would do the same in death. Put a contingency in his will for the entire option to pass to the Corcoran, which was a lesser-known gallery down in Washington, D.C. And the Corcoran said, sure, we could use the art, and they worked with the children for the financing, and they built the William A. Clark Collection wing, and there, flanking the White House for 90 years, the collection pretty much stayed intact. Until about 2013, when the Corcoran started falling on hard times. And this is a more modern headline. And this is the story of what the Corcoran started doing to try to save itself, which was auction off pieces of Clark's collection. And this talks about his sickle leaf rug that cleared $30 million, which was a record-breaking sum on Sotheby's auction block. But unfortunately, even that staggering amount of money wasn't enough to save the Corcoran. And so they went to Superior Court in Washington, D.C., and they filed this petition, which, pardon my bad Latin, is a petition for cypre, which basically says we can't do it anymore. We have to break the trust that Mr. Corcoran originally set up in his will. And Superior Court in D.C. came back with an order and said, okay, we'll let you do that, but no more of this art is going to the auction block. Instead, what's going to happen is the National Gallery of Art, which has the most space, which is right there on the National Mall, which is in the public trust, they're going to get the pick of the litter. And whatever art they don't want is going to stay in Washington, D.C. at other institutions. The building that the Corcoran was in transferred over to George Washington University, who was charged in the court order with maintaining the art school. Only one piece of art stayed with that building, and that was a gold gilded French room called the Salon Doré, which was one of Clark's favorite pieces in his collection. In the order, all the parties, the National Gallery, the Corcoran, the court itself, all acknowledged the donor restrictions that were placed on the collection of the Corcoran. And by name, several times in that order, they specifically mentioned the Clark collection by name. And the question is, why does all this matter? Here's another headline. And this talks about all the great masterpieces that the National Gallery started gobbling up. And I'll give you one guess what dead industrialist owned that beautiful Degas painting down there at the bottom. The the National Gallery has now been through multiple rounds of accession, and they've cherry-picked the best pieces of the Clark collection, along with several other 1,000 pieces from the Corcoran's holdings. And I knew about the restrictions in the will and the restrictions in the court order before I went to Washington, D.C., and my trip there, honestly, last summer, was as much to document the fact that as soon as the ink was dry on that court order, the NGA started violating the provisions of the Clark will. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but the ones that I have talked to have told me that the dead hand can't rule for perpetuity unless it is ruling with conditions that are placed upon a bequest made to a charity, which is what we're talking about here. So I opened the door into the National Gallery, still unsure if any of the Clark art would be there inside. Barely, now I'm completely lost, there we are, barely inside the granite stronghold. Auguste Rodin's Eve greeted me with the same powerful portrayal of elemental humiliation that once sent Clark into an obsessive pursuit. I inspected the marble closely, as though the faded fingerprints of Clark would again reveal themselves, as they had done so many times in our mutual destinations. From there, I moved swiftly and silently through the maze of galleries and discovered about 80 pieces of Clark's art blended in with their other contemporaries. Clark's best Degas canvas, amongst his finest treatment of ballet dancers, occupied a corner space almost unnoticed in a room full of Van Goghs and Gauguins. And that's it right there. It reminded me of Dirty Dancing. Nobody puts a baby in a corner. But they did. So here's some questions for you, and kind of a crazy idea I want to explore a little more. Is it right for a gallery with hundreds of thousands of pieces in their holdings, but only room for a few thousand to display, to get so many more masterworks like this one by Degas? And should such a fine painting ever be an afterthought in a gallery space? Should fine art be concentrated for public viewing only in major metropolitan areas? And is a piece of art that is crated up and locked away, but locked away in the holdings of a very prestigious gallery, in its proper place? And before you answer that, I want you to consider this piece, which was a masterwork by Joseph Turner. And it was one of the first pieces that the National Gallery selected from the Corcoran. Today, the only place you can see this piece of art is on the National Gallery's website, because down here in the fine print, it says not on view, which is a nice way of saying it's crated up in an environmentally controlled facility somewhere in the greater Washington area. The reason I picked this particular painting was that in 2010, for 6 weeks, this picture was amongst 4 of them that hung right here in the Butte Silver Bow Archives in conjunction with the Economic Development Summit. In other words, this is one of the only pieces of Clark's art that ever got the opportunity to see the community that helped buy it, and more importantly, was seen by the people of that community. So my crazy idea is this. I think that as a community, it's worth having a discussion about trying to honor the last will and testament of William Andrews Clark. Given that for the first time in its history, this art is now in the public trust, and given the fact that the National Gallery doesn't want Clark's dead hand telling them what to do any more than the Met did, and given the fact that as we speak, this collection is still in the process of being divvied up, I think we as a community have some leverage for just such a discussion.